Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Welcome to another episode of Sapient Thoughts, where we discuss theophilosophical issues, where we answer contentions against Islam, and where we provide a robust case for the veracity of Islam. In today's episode, which is one of a multi-part series on the topic of beauty and the recognition of God, we are going to be continuing our discussion from the last episode. So if you remember from the last episode, we had given a conceptualization of beauty. And now what we want to do in today's episode is that we are going to look at how beauty is connected to meaning in various scenarios and where we experience beauty. So let me start with, when we're talking about beauty being connected to meaning, what we're saying here is that beauty is connected to meaning in the sense that it's giving you something deeper than a surface meaning. Okay, so let's compare two types of interests. You have an aesthetic interest and a utilitarian interest. All right, now what does that mean? Let's give an example to elucidate the point. When a person sets a table for some guests, now someone could, quote unquote, set a table by putting some paper plates on the table and some plastic utensils, and and that's it. They've set the table. Now, this is one setting of a table which one could say is quite utilitarian. It's based on the utilization of the plate, in the sense that there is a practical value of the plate. The plate is there, someone takes it, they take food, and we're done. Now compare that to someone who sets the table by way of beautifying it. So there is an aesthetic interest here. And so when someone sets the table with a very nice tablecloth, they add to it, candles to the table, and they would have napkins that are cloth-based and wrapped and put on the plates. The plates have been set, and they're china plates, and utensils, real utensils, on table mats that have a design on them. And when you look at this particular setup of the dining table, you see that there's a beauty to it. This beauty transcends the mere utility of just having plates and having utensils. So what we can say is that additional element of beauty is connected with some sort of meaning, in the sense that when the host sets the table like that, it could be pointing towards something beyond just the host wants you to eat. It could be that the host values the participant or the guest that's coming over. And therefore, they took out time to beautify, because remember, beauty is something that pleases us, not in a sensual way, but there is an aspect of beauty that pleases the person. So the meaning here could be about the host, or it could also say something about the guest or the value of the guest, right? And so there's a meaning that goes beyond just the utilitarian interest. There's an aesthetic interest here, and that points to a meaning that's deeper than the surface level utility of plates and utensils. Now, we could also talk about beauty being connected to meaning, meaning it points to something deeper than a surface level meaning, when we talk about arts and entertainment. So something that is entertaining would have a kind of surface level pleasure. So when you watch a movie that is just merely entertaining, you watch it, you enjoy it, and then that's it, you're finished. But when it comes to something that is related to art, it not only has this idea of you being entertained for a short amount of time, but it allows a person, or perhaps causes a person, to think deeply. So for instance, if you're a movie buff, there may be certain movies that are just there to entertain. There may be some sort of fleeting action movies where you watch the movie, you're entertained for the duration of the movie, and that's pretty much it. You're not really thinking much about the meaning behind something related to that movie. You may have other movies where there is a certain artistic element that's very deep and very beautiful. And so there's a meaning behind it. So every kind of shot and every angle and every, the filmography and everything involved has a certain meaning. The color of the particular movie has a certain, it's supposed to convey a certain feeling which has a certain meaning. So we can look at the idea of beauty when there's a film that is, related to its beauty and its, how it's being, how it was composed, and how the audience is supposed to look at it and think about it deeply, perhaps, and compare that to, let's say, a movie that was just there for entertainment purposes. That being said, the movie that has kind of more to it, has a deeper, like a certain color hue, a certain way that the movie has been recorded, the camera angles, the types of cameras, the grittiness of the film. There's so many things that give the film a certain feeling, which is there to allow the audience or cause the audience to think deeper about the film, right? So we can see this distinction between beauty, in the sense that beauty points to meaning, and it points to something deeper than a surface level meaning, when we compare arts and entertainment. So another example that we can provide is in the realm of literature or writing. And here we can compare prose and poetry. So when we think of prose is like the composition of something. It's just something that someone has put together, and it's there for, let's say, informational purposes. So you could think of something like an organic chemistry textbook. Poetry, on the other hand, has an additional purpose behind it. Poetry not only is there to, let's say, convey some sort of information, but it's there to not only convey information, but it has an element, an added element of beauty. So if you think about prose being your organic chemistry textbook, this is something you may read once, and maybe you need to read it to study for an exam, and then you study for the exam, and then you maybe never go back to it, or maybe you go back to it just to refer and get some information, extract some information from it, but you're really never going to go back to it because you derive some sort of deeper pleasure out of that. I mean, well, maybe you derive some sort of pleasure out of it because of the subject matter, but here we're talking about the idea of it's giving you information, and that's pretty much it. Whereas when you compare that to poetry, poetry is something more. Poetry has a pleasure that is more than just extracting information from something. So if I was to read out a poem by Emily Dickinson, which is called Hope is the Thing with Feathers, let's now take a look at it and listen to this particular poem. So Emily Dickinson writes, "Hope is the thing with feathers. It perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all." So now what we see here is that there's a concept that's being put forth, and that is hope. And it's being described as a, in this case, a bird, let's say. And there's a certain beauty to the way the words have been put together, and the feeling that it gives to the person that's reading the particular poem, because they may be able to understand hope, and they understand hope as a concept, but now there's something deeper related to hope. So hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm. Now, think about this. A person that's going to the vicissitudes of life, the ups and downs, and then they have this thing called hope. And the way that Emily Dickinson is describing it by way of poetry, a person would have a certain pleasure in reading that because they can see themselves in it, perhaps. So, and sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. Again, we're talking about hope here, right? I've heard it in the chilliest land and the strangest sea, and yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. So there's a certain beauty to that. There's a certain, it's something that transcends just mere extraction of information. And so we find when we compare prose and poetry, the same phenomena when we are talking about beauty, pointing towards something deeper. It has a meaning, but it's something deeper. You can come back to this poem and read it again. There's a phenomenon that happens whereby you derive a certain pleasure. And you can go back to it and say, what did the author mean? And what was the meaning behind X, Y, and Z, and this line and that line, and this word or this sentence coming with this sentence, and so on and so forth, that you would go back to it over and over and over again. In fact, when we speak about prose and poetry, Kenneth Brooks, he writes in The Heresy of Paraphrase, he addresses the topic of can a poem be paraphrased? And he says that the reason why, and notice that it's called a heresy of paraphrase. In other words, you can't paraphrase a poem. The reason why it would be wrong in a sense, or you can't paraphrase a poem, he gives a few reasons as to why that would not be the case, why a person could not engage with trying to paraphrase a poem. He says, number one, poetry can express several thoughts at the same time. And this is true. If when you look at various poems, there are numerous thoughts that can be expressed by way of one sentence within the poem, let alone the poem itself. Number two, poems are polysemous. In other words, there's meanings conveyed on several levels. And that's also true when we think about poetry. There's several levels and layers that one can understand and one can investigate in terms of its meaning. Meaning is lost in any paraphrase. In other words, when you try to paraphrase, and to give an extreme example of this, when you try to translate one poem from one language to another, you find that there is something that is lost. And that thing that is lost is that pleasure that one derives from the poem itself, or a level of that pleasure. And you can think about this when you translate like one poem from one language to another. In the original language, there is a certain level of beauty that in most cases cannot be in the other language. You may be able to give some element of the beauty because there's a certain meaning that's been extracted from it, and you can, but the original beauty of the poem, the original sound, the original cadence of the poem, that is something that's very difficult when you try to translate it or you try to paraphrase the poem. There's something that's lost. And then the fourth one is really interesting because Kenneth Brooks then says sound is important because in many poems there's a rhyming scheme or there's a way in which the words come together such that the sound gives a certain type of meaning. And this is true when it comes to poems. This is true when it comes to even the Quran, for instance. There are certain places and elements of the Quran where the sound is indicative of a very specific meaning, and because the sound is the way it is, it enhances the meaning. So we see that in this concept of when we're talking about conceptualizing beauty, when we're talking about the idea of beauty being attached to meaning and that meaning is something deeper than the surface level, we can see that beauty adds something, or there's something more when we approach something to be beautiful. Now, in the next episode, we're going to be broaching the topic of subjective versus objective beauty. Is there such a thing as something to be objectively beautiful, or is all beauty subjective? Is beauty truly in the eyes of the beholder, no matter what a person is exposed to? Or are there indeed certain things that are objectively beautiful? That is something we're going to be speaking about in the next episode. So until then, this is Fahad Taslim, and these are Sapient Thoughts.